And the meeting is being recorded. Okay, I'm gonna get us started with some opening thoughts and reflections, and then I'll introduce myself a little bit more thoroughly. So I like to start every talk, workshop, presentation, conference, anything with a territorial acknowledgement or a land acknowledgement. So in doing this, we acknowledge the histories and present experiences that the ground beneath our feet, wherever you are now, has seen and still witnesses. We acknowledge the histories and present realities of Indigenous peoples on this land. We recognize the histories of dispossession and invisibilization that accompany Indigenous lived experiences on the land. We recognize the imperative for decolonization as an ongoing struggle. And where I am right now in Philadelphia, I am on the ancestral land of the Lenape tribe. We also, I would like us to recognize that this virtual space that we're in is not neutral. So we acknowledge that the virtual space in which we meet is one that holds the capacity both for connection and for violence. We recognize that the ways we come together virtually have been carved out by people who are marginalized, especially differently abled people aligned with the disability justice movement, as it is now called. We acknowledge that the uses and potentials of virtual space, that these uses are emergent, that they're emerging, and we recognize the imperative to not erase and co-opt the means, methods, and voices of those who have crafted this form of virtual connection. We bring our awareness to ourselves, so we acknowledge that our physical and virtual presence hinges on deeper, longer, and more complex histories than we can imagine. We bring attention to our breath in this moment, and we acknowledge and hold tenderness for where we are in our process of healing and awareness, while understanding that we must grow quickly towards accountability. Lastly, I wanted to say a word on praxis, and I'll be coming back to this, but we recognize the imperative from feminist, anti-racist, liberationist, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and the LGBTQIA movement elders and current revolutionaries that we must merge study and action, theory and practice. We recognize we exist in relationship to and participate in larger systems, and that it is our responsibility to shift aspects of ourselves that support and are supported by systems of violence. Okay. So that is my preferred way to open anything. And just to give you a little introduction to who I am, again, my name is Schneider. My connection to Drexel is that I am an adjunct professor in women's and gender studies and Africana studies, and I'm very, very sort of not present on campus, even though I live very close to campus. I am a historian by trade. I study Caribbean history, the histories of empire, of race and representation. I study in particular property and its relationship to privilege historically. And I'm a mother. I have a 7-year-old son, so that takes up a lot of my life. And I'm an organizer. I work with the Girls Justice League, which is based in West Philly, which is an empowerment org for girls and femmes between 12 and 22. And so I do a lot of thinking around how to bring critical education to spaces that are not in academia. I am white, I am cisgendered, I am able-bodied, and so I bring an acknowledgement of that into the space. My relationship to this work comes out of years of critical education through my PhD, but also before, and also through years of activism. So I've organized a lot in LA with some really, people who were really formative to me in my own way of relating to the world as they were mounting their own struggles that I was able to help with and be a warm body to show up for and eventually strategize with and everything. So I have been changed and formed through different lineages, both scholarly and also in movements with others. So this is a workshop that is really about bringing us to a point of accountability. And I would like to preface it by saying that for me, accountability and thinking around radical accountability is the only way to move forward as we move towards collective liberation. And I say this for everybody. It lands differently depending on what your positionality is within our society, right? So accountability to systems of violence, to your own placement within systems of violence can look different depending on who you are. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But in particular, I'm going to be talking about how systems of violence that we live with today are rooted in historical structures of white supremacy. And I'm going to be giving you some like historical, like a little historical scene, let's say. And then I'll be asking you to do reflection about yourself, about your communities, your ancestors, your the spaces in which you feel belonging and which you claim belonging. And so I would like to encourage everybody to be comfortable where you are listening or watching, to bring in an awareness of your own body, an awareness of your own breath. A lot of the things that I'll be talking about are things that, particularly for folks who are racialized as white, can get a little defensive about, but that's part of understanding how white supremacy works. So I would ask you to notice if and when discomfort comes up for you, and to maybe take a note of that. Often areas of discomfort are areas of growth. Within movement, we call these our growing edges. So they're areas in which you may not feel polished, you may not feel accomplished, but they are some of the richest areas for growth in different ways. What else did I want to say before I start? Oh yeah, so I'll be talking more about this, but it's important to understand that the cultures developed alongside and through white supremacy are really the waters that we swim in. And so I know that a lot of people now, you know, things are developing so quickly and have been developing so quickly over the past several weeks. I know a lot of people right now have articulated their commitments to organizing, have articulated their commitments to struggles for collective liberation, particularly around ending violence of all different kinds, especially towards Black and brown bodies. And so I've noticed that there's a frustration as folks are now starting to organize, because the ways that we come together are still largely dictated through a culture of white supremacy. So even the ways that we show up to work, the ways that we comport ourselves and have conversations, I've noticed there's a lot of frustrations around new organizing. And so hopefully this will help address some of that. My goal is to really start a conversation about how to center yourself historically, how to develop historical thinking that will help you as you are committing and recommitting to social justice. Okay, so, please feel free to put questions that you have in the chat. I will have sections of invited, like as we do the reflections, there'll be 3 different reflections. I'll ask you if you're comfortable to throw a couple of thoughts into the chat, and I will like read from them and just get a sense for where everybody is. If you don't feel comfortable with that, that's totally cool. Basically, this is like based on your level of comfort, although to maintain the, how do you say, the integrity of the whole group, we're gonna keep it to the chat, I believe. Okie dokie. All right, so this first portion is called Recognizing White Supremacy, and some of you will be familiar with this, but historically, women of color activists and feminists have really asked us to recognize that there are 3 different pillars of white supremacy. And those pillars were formed historically over centuries. So nothing sprang up overnight, but they are, pervasive and insidious, and really have determined the ways that, especially in this country, we evolved into a nation. So the 3 pillars are settler colonialism and genocide, slavery and capitalism, and Orientalism and war. So the ideas and motivations that inform all 3 of these pillars really come out of a particular period of European thought that's associated with the Enlightenment period. I'm not going to go into that. I'm not a historian of the Enlightenment, although I learned from some fantastic historians of the Enlightenment. But suffice to say that this was a really, really rich moment in European history where people were conceptualizing themselves, but they were doing it in relationship to an other. And they were doing that in like conquest, right? So you have, for example, conquistadors going to the Caribbean and to Mesoamerica who were looking at indigenous people and populations through the lens of the other. And they justified their own exploits in those areas, right? So conquest, colonization, extreme forms of violence, genocidal forms of violence, with a belief in their own integrity on a humanistic basis, on a religious basis, and on like a scientific basis, right? So this is a moment in which all of these forms of thought that were bubbling up in Europe were being used to justify Europeans' moves throughout the globe. So settler colonialism refers to the practice and the belief that Europeans and their descendants have the legitimate right to seize and settle indigenous lands. So the United States is a settler colonial society. There are several others. And there are settler colonial elements really anywhere that you see indigenous populations. So in the United States, what became a white American identity is historically dependent on the seizure of land and also the long-term genocide of indigenous populations, in addition to a narrative that erases Native American sovereignty and humanity over time, right? So you can see these in some of the different forms of cultural appropriation that happen around indigenous cultures in different ways throughout time, right? Right now, I don't know if folks are still in this moment of, what is it? It's not tribal tattoos, but there's like a festival. There was a festival before COVID. There was a festival equivalent of tribal tattoos. Anyway, you can see this narrative of being entitled to indigenous cultures as really ingrained in a practice of settler colonialism in the United States. We see this in mascots, right? This is idea that indigenous populations disappeared, that they're all gone, and that we've inherited their legacy and their legitimacy on the land. This is one of the first ways in which whiteness gets articulated historically, so it's really important to pay close attention to that. Second, we have slavery and capitalism. So slavery refers to the bondage and enslavement of Africans and their descendants in service of the economic and societal projects of Europeans and their descendants globally. So in the United States, the term chattel slavery referred to a system where slavery was inherited or was an inherited condition. It was really seen as endemic to Blackness and to Black humanity. The violence of enslavement and this attempted dehumanization of people who were racialized as Black formed the backbone of the economic growth and ideological substance of all national institutions in ways that we have still to understand and uncover. There's been a lot of academic pushback against this line of inquiry since the mid-20th century. A very, very famous work came out called Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams. It was debated crazy by other academics saying you don't have the numbers to prove this or whatever, but we're now in a really great place in terms of scholarship where there's been an acknowledgement of the truth of some of this, and now we're going forward into other, applying this in across fields. So in particular, racial capitalism is a term that refers to capitalism's dependency on racialized forms of labor and property for its growth. So in essence, capitalism and racial capitalism as it happened in the Americas couldn't have happened if it hadn't been for the enslavement of Africans and their descendants, and also property and property law as racially encoded or racially, dependent. So this racial capitalism manifests today as the devaluation of Black and otherwise racialized labor, and it ties the worth of Black bodies solely to their productive potential. And the racial justification of these practices is included in racial capitalism. And so just as settler colonialism is one way in which whiteness starts to get articulated historically, capitalism and racial capitalism is really where Blackness as a concept is invented legally. So this is again over centuries, right? This is spanning the 15th really the 16th through the 19th centuries. And there's amazing scholarship on this. If you're interested, I can definitely point you to some of that. Lastly, Orientalism and war. So Orientalism refers to the process through which Europeans and Americans defined the West as a superior civilization. So this arose out of European imperialism and colonialism, in particular in like the Middle East, in South Asia and East Asia, but then it became applied to the United States as a logic. So this says that Eastern, or so-called Oriental others, again, this is an other logic, a binary logic, are racialized and thought of as inferior or untrustworthy. This shows up in gendered, racial, and religious discourses. So that inferiority is often feminized, and a discourse of masculinity is often used to justify the West's superiority. So the United States is, sees itself as a masculine nation in the way that it approaches the rest of the world. And so this discourse is used to justify an endless war of terror. You can think about this in terms of the Crusades through the present, and the contemporary profiling of Arab Americans as part of that war. And so as an ongoing practice, the sort of this endless war against the other relies on the other two pillars. It relies on racial capitalism and it relies on settler colonialism, both to justify this war, right? This war is protecting our entitlement to these things, to our wealth, to our land. And it's also, obviously fueled by those pillars as well. Okay, that was maybe my densest little portion. What's really important to take away from this, in my opinion, is that each of these structures resulted, each of these structures is enduring, right? So each of them has lasted and persisted across centuries. So you can see like I'm just trying to decide which thing to read and which thing to just skip over. So each of these structures reinforce power and privilege and also violence. And each has also historically been qualified by race. So violence is institutionalized within each of these structures differently. In recognizing the enduring and complex legacies of white supremacy, we also recognize that these are our collective inheritances. So I'm going to list a few of these. So our legal system in the United States is formed out of these pillars. The concept and the practice of racial privilege and racialization comes out of these pillars. Heteropatriarchal gender roles and norms, ideas about inferiority and superiority based on gender, come out of these systems. Policing and incarceration are direct descendants from these pillars. Our systems of property and property rights and who can own property, et cetera, is again one of the ways in which structures of white supremacy reproduce and reinforce themselves. And that's an analysis that comes out of critical race studies. You see things like environmental racism, differential treatment in medicine and in healthcare. And we can also see these manifest in our national narratives of prosperity and freedom, which are really contingent on things like racial capitalism and racial violence to shore up a claim to freedom, prosperity, individualism and all of that for the select few, obviously. We see this too in ableism in our material structures and in our very concept of who is human, who gets to be a human. And we also see this in our expectations around labor. So it's important to recognize that these structures were mutually constructed historically. None of them, arose in a vacuum. They all leaned on each other as they were being created. They were created through practice, through years and years of trying to enact different forms of social control, trying to get more and more capital out of colonial American society and then out of American society after independence. So each of these institutions creates, supports, and mirrors privilege and power in different ways. So, for example, the exclusion of Black Americans from legal personhood historically was reinforced by other legal practices of racialization through racial violence and also through the belief in white superiority. I'm going to skip over this. So another example that came up for me today, I was listening to a panel in the field of critical archival studies, and even things like someone's legal right to privacy is contingent on race. So we see this especially in the documentation and the footage that surrounds Black death. You can really see, like, and people have, oh no, I hope my phone doesn't, sorry. I forgot that FaceTime would open on my computer. Okay, yeah, we see really a disrespect and a disregard for Black humanity in the ways that, for example, police brutality is documented and circulated online, the way that it's preserved online. It's what we call a spectacle, right? And from a legal standpoint, the ability to assert privacy, materially as well as legally, has really been dependent on whiteness, which is, for me, like, there's almost no arena in which we can't identify how structures of white supremacy are informing how we come to that, how we interact, how we exist. Okay, so I'm trying to make this fast. I'm going to take you into a reflection, and so I'd like you to spend a few minutes thinking about yourself, thinking about your ancestors, thinking about the communities in which you find belonging, maybe thinking about the areas in which you stay. Again, the communities in which you circulate. And I'm going to present my screen to you really quick. Are you seeing what I'm seeing? Actually, Caroline, if you could just tell me, I can't see any of y'all. If you could tell me if y'all are seeing this.
Not yet.
Oh, okay. Cool. Thank you. Let me do it again. Okay. So can you see now?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so there's a bunch of questions here, but you don't have to answer all of them. This is really just a moment to reflect. So I want you to think about, how were your ancestors, how were their different experiences of privilege, oppression, and resistance shaped within these structures or within structures similar to them? So white supremacy is not limited to the United States, it's a global phenomenon. Power and control of power is not limited to anywhere. So I want you to try to think about what you know of your ancestors. And this can be a little triggering because what we know and do not know of our ancestors is also determined by race in the United States. And so if you are in a space of not knowing, I would invite you to think about the communities that you participate in, what you know of your lineage, what you know of your ancestors, and to go from there. So the second question is, what do you inherit from global histories of dispossession, settler colonialism, imperialism, war, and material and social privilege and racialization? So we talked about the collective inheritance, but I want you to think about what you personally inherit from any of those systems. I would say personally, part of my family is Polish Jewish, who came to the United States in like the 20s. And so part of what I inherit in the United States is an ability to become white that was granted, to Jewish folks in the mid-century, et cetera. So that's like an example of my inheritance, and there's many others. And then what kinds of questions would you need to ask in order to learn more about this? So I'm going to give you just a few minutes to take down to take note of your thoughts. And if you have anything that you would like to put in the chat, feel free to do so. Just about your thoughts, what you're thinking about it, etc. I'll let you know when we come back to. So take another 30 seconds or so to jot down your final thoughts. You know, where is your inheritance located? Is it in your body? Is it in your material possessions? Is it in your spirituality? Is it in your mental health? Is it in your relationship to gender, sexuality? Is it in the way that you move through spaces, public or private spaces? What are the legacies that you inherit? And how were they bound up in historical structures? Okay, so you can go ahead, and if anybody feels like posting anything in the chat, let me get back into here and stop sharing my screen. Yeah, so if anybody feels like posting anything that you're thinking, please feel free and I will refer back to it. But also, no pressure. Okay. So that whole part is what I like to call, it's like a process of historical centering, and it's something that you don't really do enough. And I'm trying to develop that as like a real thing that I do. So I'm going to move on to talking about the shape of violence under these systems. So systems and structures rooted in white supremacy institutionalize and normalize different forms of violence. So violence, like privilege and oppression, is manifest at all levels of society, from institutional to interpersonal to our identities and our emotional patterns. So when we talk about levels of oppression or levels of privilege, we really talk about the minute, right? So the interior, your self-talk, what are you telling yourself? The interpersonal, how do you relate to other people? How do they relate to you? Institutional, how do institutions treat you? And then systemic, right? So where are you located in terms of bigger systems? So violence is manifest through these systems at all of those levels. When we normalize violence, it can look like accepting experiences of poverty, of houselessness, of food insecurity, of gender-based violence and racial violence as natural and inevitable. And we, you know, how do you say? It's like we anesthetize ourselves against those things in order to say, well, this is just a natural part of our society. the ways that violence is experienced and reproduced, or the ways that, those ways are deeply rooted in one's race, gender, and ability, and understanding experiences of systemic violence demands that we adopt an intersectional framework. So for anyone who, or Caroline and others who were in my intersectional liberation movements class, you know, it's really, really important to use an intersectional framework to even understand how you relate to society, and how you relate to others who are also being oppressed but differently within our society. So intersectional organizing demands that you really have that broader scope, so that you're not organizing against somebody else with your activism, but rather you're saying, okay, here's how I'm positioned in this particular system, right? I might have access to certain kinds of privilege. I'm also oppressed in other ways. This person, the shape of their oppression or the shape of the violence coming towards them may look different, and the shape of their privilege may look different as well. So it's really, really foundational to be aware of those things in order to be accountable in your own activism. So you don't engage in what people call like the oppression Olympics, for example, which is just like really a capitalist framework for like competing against others for funding or for recognition or for validation, et cetera. So white supremacy teaches us to sacrifice our youth, our labor, and our pleasure to larger projects rooted in narratives of education and discipline, efficiency and productivity, and heteronormative expectations around relationships, pleasure, and reproduction. The most privileged among us experience fulfillment and feel actualized as we attempt and clear the hurdles of these societal expectations, right? So it's not easy to succeed for anybody. I mean, like maybe for some people it's easy, but it's not easy really, but it's definitely more attainable based on the forms of privilege that you inherit. So it's not saying that you didn't work your ass off to get through med school, but it is saying that your positionality definitely played a role in you getting in the door. And that applies to lots of things. We gain social acceptance by having our racial identities, gender identities, and relationships, and especially marriages, uplifted and mirrored by mainstream society. Economic privilege directly facilitates our success in every arena, and these identities are rooted in the nation as founded by and within structures of white supremacy. So I invite you to think a little bit about where violence is manifest. What do you think of when you think of violence? I want you to note that for yourself. If anyone feels like dropping anything in the chat, feel free. But our definition of violence really isn't usually expansive enough. And there's some really, really good new work that is building off of a Kingian philosophy of nonviolence, right? So nonviolence as was practiced by Martin Luther King Jr. That really, really insists on an institutional understanding of violence and how it manifests. Ooh, nice. Violence makes nature versus nurture when it comes to violence. Yes, that's a really, really cool example actually, and not one that people typically list. But yeah, so like training, right? And discipline and what you're taught and how you are regulated even within families, right? So for those of you who are taking class with me, we talk about patriarchal violence as really hurting everybody who it impacts, really hurting everybody who interacts with patriarchy, but in different ways, right? So in the home, patriarchy can look like gender-based violence. It can look like gender-based marginalization of women and femmes, but violence can also be conceptualized as emotional violence towards people who are masculinized, people who are identified as men. And so those are different ways to conceptualize it. Oh yeah, violence is portrayed as a means to an end, even there are many ways besides it, exactly. So violence we often see in terms of like confrontation as being, exactly what you said, the means to an end, the way to get something. But what nonviolence folks are arguing is that violence really just begets more violence or just perpetuates violence. And so as we think about collective liberation and we think about our tools, like I'm not for nonviolence in terms of like direct action, but I am for eradicating institutional violence because I don't want to reproduce that. And a lot of social movements have failed in the ways that they reproduce different forms of violence, especially patriarchy, I would say. There's been a lot of, it's this, you can see this in almost every social movement that is not intersectional, that they'll end up reproducing some form of structural violence. Because they're saying, well, we're marginalized, we want to be on top, but being on top necessarily means marginalizing other people. Yes, when I think of violence, I think of aggression due to frustration impacting the population. Yes, yes, exactly. So that violence will always be manifest mostly towards folks who are weaker or more susceptible or more marginalized. So while I agree with the frustration that violence shows us, right, that has always been there, I have no way to challenge that, nor would I want to. As a solution in and of itself, we really, I think, would be better served to think about how deeply different forms of structural violence impact us. And so, for example, like we can see, like, I'm going to name some things that are included under violence that comes out of white supremacy, just for examples. So like intergenerational trauma is a form of violence that comes out of white supremacy. Racial violence and lynching, of course, is a very, very tangible form of violence that comes out of white supremacy, even though it has been historically erased and belittled. Carcerality and the carceral state, so a system that criminalizes Black and brown populations with the end goal of caging and eliminating them. And carcerality is manifest in all sorts of different institutions. State-sanctioned violence, which is an extension of carcerality. Again, disparities in treatment, in health, in guilt and shame that people feel in their historical amnesia. So the erasure of history is also a form of violence, or the erasure of a historical knowing or a historical awareness, especially because we have such a violent past as a country. That's also in itself a form of violence. You know, shame that people feel around their sexuality is a form of violence that comes out of societal structures, right? We're told to be one thing, we're not that thing. Our internal processes often inflict a lot of violence on ourselves and a lot of times other people. And that's what we see a lot in terms of transphobia and in terms of violence and murders of especially Black trans women. Gender-based violence. Hegemonic masculinity. So the insistence that to be a man, to be masculine, you have to fit into a very, very specific box. But to do that takes an incredible amount of violence against yourself and other people. And then binary thinking. So the idea that there's only one or the other option, there's only Black or white, there's only good or bad, etc. Those are all forms of violence that come out of white supremacist structures. And again, for more information on this, like, please hit me up, because there's so much good writing about this and there's so much good research about this. Okay, I'm gonna do another shorter reflection and then I'll go into my last little piece. I'm aware that we're running short on time. Share screen. Okay, so here's my screen and it presents. Okay, so I would my slides got messed up. Okay, don't do that. I don't know what's happening with that honeycomb, but it's okay. So I want you to think about, how do you casually consume violence? What does it taste like? Which is a weird question, but kind of evocative for some people. And where does your taste for different kinds of violence come from? Again, for folks who've been in my classes, you know that we talk a lot about this in terms of the erotic and the erotic imagination. And so like we could have a whole conversation about the mainstream porn industry and the ways that that perpetuates different forms of gendered and racial violence, and stereotypes, right? So the stereotypes that give way to violence. So when we talk about our taste for violence, that's really what I'm talking about. It's like, where do you consume it? Is it in the products that you use? Is it in the ideologies that you espouse? Who are you without your productivity? Who are you without social validation, right? How is it possible for you to disengage your self-worth from expectations of productivity? Not saying that we don't need those to survive, because right now with our system we do, but this is an exercise in terms of thinking outside of that. And then where do you experience guilt and shame? Where are you growing and questioning? How are you working towards your own healing? Or what are the areas in which you feel like your own healing is emergent? Just take a minute. I can also make these questions available to people if you want them. Sometimes it's hard to know where you experience guilt and shame because we spend a lot of energy covering those things up from ourselves. So I think a more accessible way of asking that question might be, what feelings do you dismiss in yourself? Or what feelings do you shame yourself for having, right? This is especially a moment, and I've been an abolitionist for a number of years, but like this is especially a moment in which we're asked to reimagine ourselves outside of these structures. So in doing that, you have to have an awareness of the structures themselves, but talking about like, who are you without your productivity is essentially a way of asking, where is your value, right? Where is your value relationally, right? How do you, we're trying to figure out new ways to exist that aren't contingent on just like producing and producing and producing. Okay, I'm gonna end the reflection for now, and then move on to my final piece of information for you. Share. Okay. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about abolition. And abolition can only be conceptualized within a knowledge of systemic violence. Because without that knowledge, why would you need it, right? So recognizing white supremacy, its origins and its legacies as one critical part of organizing towards collective liberation. If we recognize that everyone is impacted by white supremacy differently, essentially that we're all participating in a similar system, then we can target the sources of violence instead of competing with one another over scarce resources. And instead of competing with one another within a scarcity mentality as well, because we actually, there's a whole bunch of thinking and organizing around working out of an abundance mentality as opposed to a scarcity mentality, but I think that's too much for right now. So abolitionist movements are global and recognize that other worlds are possible, and our need for transformation is really urgent. And this is a moment in which that's really visible to us. Sometimes it's less visible. Abolitionist organizing has been happening since the beginning of all of these systems, but most prominently since like mid-20th century. They recognize that systems rooted in white supremacy cannot be healed or transformed from within. At their core, they do not hold a capacity to care for those marginalized by race, class, gender, and ability. So these systems will always be trying to bring people up to a standard, up to a normal. It is a normal that is rooted in white supremacist thinking, which is ableism, you know, again, racism, all the different isms. Abolitionist solutions are locally derived, right? So they're looking at, you know, what needs to happen at your local level. And they mainly seek local solutions in place of systemic ones or systemic violence. Some examples of abolitionist movements would be the movement for prison abolition, clearly. Our contemporary movement around abolishing the police. The movement for universal basic income supports an abolitionist agenda. Movements for decolonization and the recognition of indigenous sovereignty is an abolitionist agenda. Radical accountability, which is emerging, which I'll talk about. Movements for food sovereignty and food justice are abolitionist. Movements for environmental justice are abolitionist. Disability justice movements are abolitionist. So abolitionist politics is, quote, it's not about what is possible, but about making the impossible possible. Really, it's about projecting your imagination outside of systems that have corralled your imagination for centuries. But we didn't always live in these systems, and we don't have to anymore. It's really a choice. So which brings me to accountability, right? So I'm going to talk about accountability to violence, accountability to one another and to ourselves. And for me, having a framework of accountability that is based on those three things is really necessary to have integrity in your activism or in whatever arena you choose to articulate your voice. So it's necessary that we become accountable to a historical understanding of violence and how it manifests in present harms. And you can do your research, right, in terms of like the area in which you are passionate, right, the areas in which you lived, et cetera, and figure out sort of how violence manifests in that arena. Accountability is an anti-racist practice. It centers the experiences, perspectives, and voices of those who are oppressed within our systems. Those who experience racial violence, dispossession, and the gendered dimensions of both of those things. And it's really important to, thank you. Sorry, I was just looking at the comments. Oh, there's comments, okay. I'm gonna come back to these comments in a second. But, you know, it's very important, like listening is a really important aspect of accountability and of any kind of anti-racism work, because if you are benefiting from whiteness, then you need to actively try to decenter yourself within these conversations, because it's not, you know, it's not a judgment on your intentions, et cetera, or I should say on our intentions, et cetera. But it is an acknowledgement that with privilege comes a certain amount of blindness to the realities of those who are not privileged. So it's just saying like, okay, maybe my perspective isn't like the whole truth on this issue. So the experiences of those who are most marginalized within our systems, and this is why why it's so important, for example, to pay attention to, you know, Black trans women's experiences as one example, because they ground us in our social truths, our societal truths. They are a complex record of our past, and there is no future without our commitment to collective healing in the face of the past. Accountability, like abolition, must be based in the recognition that we have learned a taste for justice and freedom that supports systems of carcerality and violence. It's hard if you take a case, let's say, of extreme interpersonal violence or gender-based violence. It's hard to imagine for us a justice that doesn't involve locking someone up, right? but this is a taste that we've developed, again, and it doesn't have to, like, if we look at transformative justice or restorative justice practices, we don't have to depend on carcerality so much. So it involves recognizing where our reflexes are in those senses. We can learn a new taste for justice through developing and practicing forms of restorative and transformative justice, or at least even like reading about what those entail. And those don't perpetuate punishments or incarceration or marginalization as a basis for justice, right? They're based on community accountability, et cetera. Accountability has to happen in public in the form of memorial, of monuments, and education. It also must happen in private as part of our individual healing processes. So it really has to happen at every level of society. Accountability looks like recognizing how guilt and shame over our collective history in the United States has manifest in state-sanctioned violence in the name of progress. Accountability is rooted in mutual care and a commitment to creating relationships, institutions, and structures that care deeply for and uplift one another. Accountability is rooted in what Bell Hooks calls love as the practice of freedom. And it's a radical commitment first to personal healing. I'm going to give you one last reflection, and I'm going to read these comments while I do that. No, that's not the right thing. Wait. Oh, there we go. Okay. So, I don't know if you can, actually, I won't read the comments. So I'm asking you to think about care as really the basis for accountability. And I want you to think about what are your ancestral, communal, or personal methods for accounting for the past, right? Maybe you have cultural traditions you've inherited. Maybe you have tried instituting your own traditions in your chosen family. Maybe we're not really into that, but like, still, you have, most people have a way of approaching and thinking about the past. What kinds of narratives are celebrated within your families and communities? And what parts of your history go unspoken? For me, that's a particularly rich one, just because we often hear stories about people's successes, right? We hear stories about, how somebody pulled it off, even though the odds were stacked against them, et cetera. But we really, until recently, it was really hard to hear stories in your family about sexual assault and violence, about mental health, about illness, right? Or chronic illness, especially. Even as recently as the 1940s and 30s, FDR had to hide the fact that he was in a wheelchair, and he was supported in that by the media, because to be disabled was to be weak and was to be stigmatized in that era, right? So all, these things more or less still exist. What parts of your identity easily flow into narratives that are celebratory, right? I'm a strong man. I'm a tenacious student. But which parts of your identity don't really work with those narratives, or don't really fit with them? And then lastly, where do the practices and traditions that root your identity, where do they support connections based on care? Another way of saying this is where is there space in your personal identity and practice to open up a practice of being more intentionally caring towards others or towards yourself? You can think about this in terms of religious traditions that close down certain narratives, but also might, through practices, open up certain other ones. You can even think about, in terms of your practices, let's say, of self-care or self-love, how can that practice become more expansive and aware in recognition of structural forms of violence and inequality, but also where can you make space for moving differently into the future? Just give you half a minute. It's often interesting to think about what your body's reaction to any of these questions are. And often the answers to these questions also come out of your body. Again, in my classes, we've read some really, really beautiful work in terms of like the stories that your body can tell that you would never dare to repeat or that are not supported by national narratives. For example, let's say if in your community, it's really important to stay strong because you've been facing systemic violence for centuries, right? Exposing your community to hearing about your own sexual assaults, let's say as a kid, or to hearing about your own struggles with mental health, is seen as belittling your community's strength and integrity. But it's really important to pay attention to those stories because those narratives that we hold are based in ideas about growth, ideas about competition, et cetera, that really come out of a capitalist framework as tied to white supremacy. So it's just, as we organize, everybody should have a right to be seen and to be vulnerable within the structures that we're building for ourselves. And so for me, accountability is really rooted in that practice. And it's really, really being real with yourself, but also like making space for others' emotional and historical truths to also get a voice, be seen, be recognized, etc. Okay, so that's it for my presentation and reflections. I'm just going to take a second to look at these comments. Yeah, I'm seeing a comment that has something to do with like the American dream, right? We're like definitely fed narratives, I'm really big into historical narrative as a historian. I'm just like, I love thinking about this. But yeah, like the ability to live up to or not to live up to that narrative of that sort of hopeful prosperity is contingent on so many different historical structures that are qualified by race. Yeah, I think that this is a moment, so I'm looking at this comment from Abby, right? Which is that abolition is the needed antithesis to Trump's Make America Great Again. And I agree. I think that abolition was here before Trump. These structures were here much before Trump, before 45, I should say. But what's interesting about this moment is that it's almost as if everything is coming to a head and is more visible than it was before. It's also like we're in a really, really specific moment which has benefited from decades of organizing towards abolitionist agendas. So we're really only able to have this conversation because of the organizing that was happening really like, so when we talk about the civil rights movement, we talk about the long civil rights movement, which really started in the 1930s as labor organizing after the Great Migration. This is like some too much history maybe. And we are still living within that moment because there was always like a violent backlash against civil rights for the whole time that it was being advocated for. So yeah, this particular moment, folks were not ready to have a conversation about abolition 10 years ago. They weren't able to have a conversation about abolition in the 80s. They weren't able to have a conversation about abolition, especially not white folks, like in the mid 20th century. It's very, very, a very brief time ago that a lot of our ancestors were like really bigoted. So it's, we are benefiting from a moment in which there's been so much organizing already. Right. So I wanted to acknowledge this comment about questions about ancestors, family, and tradition causing anxiety. Um, I brought up before that it can be triggering for folks, and so clearly, you know, I'm not trying to push you further into that anxiety. The knowing, or where that knowing lands in your body, or the not knowing, is really important to take note of. And then there's also some really, really wonderful work that's being done around this in terms of like excavating memory, and especially when traditional archives are not sufficient, and especially when, like, let's say the histories of Black communities in the United States in particular, and Indigenous communities, have been systemically erased as part of the structure that created things like race, that created capitalism. So your unease and your anxiety is completely founded. And I guess I would focus on where your body tells you to go with that, right? So how to sort of nourish yourself in the knowledge of not knowing. Oh, you all are really, really amazing with these comments. Salvation, sadly, every person comes. Right. Right. So, Maurice, I'm looking at your leapfrog comments. I feel like even this idea that, like, there's this generational, you know, pulling up of somebody else, and that there's like this race to making it, speaks to the difficulty of inclusion and of making it in general within these systems. I think this idea that you have to launch yourself, to catapult yourself into success, simply not to be successful, but also simply not to be harmed, or to simply be whole, or simply be safe and healthy, comes directly out of a mentality that is contingent on the structures of white supremacy. You shouldn't have to catch up to be safe, right? Your ancestors shouldn't have had to struggle like that to be seen as human and to be seen as whole. And so for me, that just really, like, you can think about that in terms of intergenerational trauma, the ways that especially Black communities are not, how do you say, are taught not to be vulnerable to all of the different kinds of pain and marginalization that they experience just to survive, right? I'm very privileged. I mean, I'm aware of this almost every day. I try to like experience my emotions and give myself space to experience my emotions so that they don't get stuck, so I can like keep processing them and everything. But I realize that that's a luxury that folks who are simply focused on survival don't have, because if you get caught up in those emotions, then it's like, what am I even doing here? Like, what project am I even contributing to anymore, you know? Camille's family is really good at uplifting successes, but we don't talk about how we came here or the definite part we played in white supremacy, right? This is like very much across the board, especially in families that are racialized as white, right? Whiteness is a property status, right? Whiteness is a social status. Whiteness is a claim to power. And the ability to move into that claim or to make that claim is contingent on like a certain amount of forgetting. And that's what I study. So I study historical amnesia in relationship to material wealth. Super interesting in my opinion. And if anyone wants more readings about property and whiteness in particular, I've got you. In particular, I would look at George Lipsett's The Possessive Investment in Whiteness. He was sort of a foundational writer in ethnic studies in the UC system, in the University of California system. And then also Cheryl Harris, Whiteness as Property, is a really, really brilliant Harvard Law Review article. It came out like over 20 years ago, but she really, really breaks it down. Again, her name is Cheryl Harris. The article is Whiteness as Property. You can totally get it online for free. Right. I'm looking at Olga's comments about being LGBT plus and being Mexican. Right, right. So I really like this comment about the continuing narrowing of narratives. Um, it's interesting because as we adopt narratives for ourselves, a lot of those narratives are themselves super exclusionary. So, for example, like if we look at like the gay rights movement in particular, or if we look at women's rights movement from like the mid 19th century, both of those movements were framed around really elitist claims to like marriage, property ownership, you know, whether you were able to own property or inherit property, again, whether you're able to be legally married. It's like a status. It's a movement that also erased a lot of Black, Indigenous, people of color um, as being like the founders of those movements, or being incredibly formative in terms of both women's rights and now what we're calling LGBTQIA rights. And so, yeah, it's a way that like when you subscribe to anyone, it's very possible to be like even further narrowing your identity. Yeah, abolition really is like ultimately like where we're trying to go, ultimate progress. Thank you, Abby. Yeah, I guess I would like to ask, I would like to hear from you if you have time. It could be that you don't, and that's okay. But if you think about your own commitments to organizing, your own commitments to social justice, how what's like one way that you could practice being accountable, either to yourself or wherever you're organizing, whatever sphere you're organizing in. And again, like accountability can really be like sitting with your feelings of discomfort, sitting with your anxiousness, especially if you're Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, like caring for yourself in a real way is enough. If you are racialized as white, then we have the saying that our activism should be proportional to our privilege. And especially the ways in which you engage in activism should mirror the forms of privilege that you have. So for example, I have a PhD in history. I teach in universities sometimes. I'm a scholar. And so it's really my job and my duty to be exercising my activism at this level. In addition to, you know, thinking about how I relate to folks economically, thinking about my relationship to inheritance in general, thinking about the way that my body moves through space, etc. But like, I'm using my tools, or I'm trying to best use my tools to like contribute, you know? I don't know if that feels helpful for folks. Again, I would like to stress that for me, activism can really only happen successfully through a framework of accountability. Right, so thank you. Pledging to center the voices of those who are marginalized, right? So magnify, uplift, amplify the experiences and the voices of those who are impacted, especially in this moment, by racial violence and by gendered violence, especially by police brutality and killings. Yes, so Tiana, thank you so much. Acknowledging that there's, no matter how much you learn, there will always be more to learn. Right, learning is a process that lasts forever. I know I feel really, really blessed to be, which is like cliche, I know, but the academic and organizing genealogies that I come out of, or the lineages that I come out of, really inspire me. Like, I'm nobody if I'm not constantly learning, or if I'm not constantly engaging in a process of like deep introspection and also of study, right? We talk about the role of radical study in our movements. For me, that's really important too. Right, and there's no, just to the last part of your comment, the most important part is to continue learning rather than to be right? So we have to acknowledge that just as all of these systems were formed historically, we're also in a moment that is evolving and unfurling and unrolling over time. So what I might be saying even in this very moment, you know, I'm sure I will have to revise my stance on accountability, or I have to revise my stance on justice. I was recently faced with a situation where there was just an extreme instance of interpersonal violence between two people I very much care for. And it really challenged my ability to think about what my approach to justice has been, and how that wasn't enough in terms of what they were going through, right? So transformative justice doesn't look the same if you're in if people are in an abusive relationship dynamic, for example. And I was like approaching everything from a very transformative justice framework. So super important that you're always like calibrating and learning based on what's been going on. I would also say that it's really important while we're on the learning thing, like really try to, like this is work that has been happening. So as you start engaging in these streams of activism and of organizing, you don't have to create your own thing. In fact, especially if you are a white person like me, please don't right away, right? Please support, like please learn as much as you can. Please support as actively as you are able to the work that others have been doing. And through that, then you will like come into your own understanding of where your efforts are best, you know, I don't know what word I'm looking for, where your best efforts will be best received and most effective, right? Yes. Yeah, so practicing accountability can look like practicing allyship, or what we talk about now is being an accomplice. Allyship, even though by itself as a word, it's fine, it does come with a certain amount of performativity. And so there's a lot of performative activism. It's super toxic. There's a lot of infighting with that. And in terms of like, well, this is the best way forward. And now that I have a voice in this movement, like I'm gonna use it and blah, blah, blah. And so there's a way that allyship kind of like muddies the waters a little bit sometimes. But yeah, being of service or even demonstrating a service model of leadership is something that I would invite people to look into. That's something I try for when I organize with the Girls Justice League. It's like, I do a lot of organizing with them, but I have to try to always decenter myself from that work, because it's a girl-led organization, and also it's primarily girls and femmes of color. And so I'm just like, my agenda doesn't really have much of a place there. And so if you think of yourself like you are contributing to this movement, in everything that you do, you're either contributing or you're being passive or you're actively not contributing to it. And so, yeah, I would just, investigate service leadership as a model. Investigate nonviolence. There's really good work out by Kazu Haga, who is a long-term nonviolence facilitator. His book is called Healing Resistance, and there's like some podcast episodes with him and whatever, but that's a really good way to think about how you engage with these movements. Yeah, thank you for, sorry, I know this is going on. Yeah, for sure. Performative activism is super related to policing. Please don't put yourself in the role of policing other people's engagement in anything unless, no, don't police anyone, number one. But, you know, that's not to say don't be actively engaging people who are immediately around you or related to you who are being like directly problematic about something, you know, like have that conversation, but not from like a policing standpoint. Oh, nice. Thank you for this memory tool. I like this. You all check out the comments. I really appreciate having been here. I will include my information in an email that Maurice will send around tomorrow. I'm going to be running a workshop series called Growing Out of Whiteness, specifically for folks who are racialized as white, that does a lot of this work, but that looks into historical structures like a little bit more in depth. So we'll be looking at property and inheritance. We'll be looking at masculinity and patriarchy in particular and its relationship to shame. And we'll also be looking at capitalism, racial capitalism, and its relationship to desire. And so that's going to be a 3-part thing starting in August and then going every month. So I'll include the information for that. Please always feel free to contact me. Again, my information will go out to all y'all. But I appreciate you for having me so much. It's really nice to see the faces of those of you who I know. And thank you again.
Thank you so much, Winter. That was awesome. Maurice, do you want to talk a little bit about the chat that's going to be happening next week?
You know, I don't think I can follow Winter right now. So instead, everybody who actually registered to be a part of this chat, I'll send a little blurb about it when I send out the recording of this so that people can reference it with also with Winter's Instagram handles and email so that you can potentially stay in contact with her as well. So I can't follow all of this greatness. So I'm going to do that within the email.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I hope you learned something and that we will see you at our next Chai Chat. Stay safe. Bye.